Good morning. I'm very excited to welcome Nina Caven this morning. She is a writer, a community organizer, and she's the executive director of Dear Evanston, a social media platform that seeks to engage Evanstonians in constructive dialogue and action around the issues of racial equity and youth gun violence. Dear Evanston offers a space where Evanstonians whose voices are less often heard can share their stories. Nina built Dear Evanston from a group project started in Leadership Evanston in 2016, which is why I said that Jennifer Moran is responsible for all of us here today. It began as a Facebook page with a following of one, her husband, to 9,200 followers today. It continues to grow on the Facebook page and now includes face-to-face encounters in the citywide Dear Evanston Racial Justice Book Group, which meets and facilitated community conversations around issues such as contemporary segregation, eviction, mass incarceration, and racial inequity in education and economic opportunity. As you will hear today, Dear Evanston, the social media platform, the Racial Justice Book Group, also gathers people from all over the city and packs them into buses. Buses from Evanston to Washington in 2017 at the inauguration, from Evanston to Springfield, Illinois in 2018, and most recently from Evanston to Montgomery, Alabama, a ride Charlotta and I took part in and shared a few highlights with you the day after we returned. Now let's hear the full story from Nina Caven herself. Please give her and her fellow travelers a big round of applause, a warm welcome to the Evanston Lighthouse Rotary.
Okay, I've never been 11 years before. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Linda, for inviting me today. And thank you to my fellow riders who are here to support and to speak, and just that you came and woke up so early in the morning to be here. Before I start, I just want to take one short minute to remember Tatiana Jefferson, who was shot and killed in her own home 2 days ago, a Black woman who was playing with her 8-year-old son. And this kind of issue is part of why we did this journey. So we remember her name. Okay. Lifelong Evanstonian Letitia Barge brought a bottle of bubbles to Montgomery, Alabama. Outside the Legacy Museum, the morning after our long bus journey from Evanston, she waved her wand high to release buoyant bubbles into the humid air. On Sunday, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Letitia's bubbles wafted weightless over the waters of the Alabama River, each a perfect, round, glowing, floating world. I'm releasing souls, she told me. 2 summers ago, I came across an article about a brand new museum and memorial that were being built to acknowledge the brutality of slavery, honor and remember its victims, and victims of racial terror lynching, and address the ongoing scourge of systemic and everyday racism today. The museum and memorial were the brainchild of attorney and author Bryan Stevenson, one of my true heroes. Stevenson is revered for founding the Equal Justice Initiative, which is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, to challenging racial and economic justice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, talks about his work defending mostly poor African-American prisoners, most of them on death row. His work forced him to experience close up the racism in our justice system that results in disproportionate numbers of Black and low-income people being incarcerated and sentenced to die. Based on his work, Stevenson offers 4 approaches to fighting racial injustice. First, get proximate. You cannot solve problems or make assessments from a distance. You need to understand the nuances and the details. 2, get uncomfortable. We are all broken, and in brokenness, we understand something about compassion. To truly fight for justice, we must be prepared for an uncomfortable journey. 3, change the narrative. We must begin to talk about the ills of the past and their connection to today. Truth and reconciliation as a nation are all needed before we can begin to change the American narrative on race. 4, embrace hope. Despite the myriad headlines of growing inequality and racial tensions, Stevenson cautions against reacting with despair and to instead protect our hope quotient. Hope, he says, is what gets you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say be quiet. Everything about Bryan Stevenson's work and approach spoke to me when I first read his book 4 years ago at Leadership Evanston, so Jennifer introduced me to that book. And now here's this museum and memorial. So I grew up in South Africa in 1964. I was born in 1964 during apartheid. My childhood was spent against a backdrop of signs on benches, buses, bathrooms, and beaches that said, for whites only, for non-whites. And that was the least of apartheid's atrocities. In 2001, just 7 years after apartheid ended, the Apartheid Museum opened in Johannesburg. I am Jewish. My grandparents lost almost all their family at Auschwitz extermination camp in Poland during the Holocaust. Auschwitz became a memorial site in 1947, just 2 years after the end of the Holocaust. Sites like this and many others have stood for decades as monuments to the 6 million Jews and others who were murdered by the Nazis. There are Holocaust museums around the world, including one right here in Skokie. I am an American. Though I'm an immigrant, I live in and benefit from the bounty of a country that was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of Africans. They were captured, whipped, shipped, separated from family, enslaved, sold, bartered, and lynched. But unlike South Africa and Germany, though this country's brutal history of slavery ended 154 years ago, until just 2 years ago, no comprehensive museum and monument stood to acknowledge slavery, lynching, the fight for civil rights, and the tragedy of mass incarceration today. I'm an Evanstonian. For 19 years, I lived in Northwest Evanston, the city where my Northwestern University graduate husband and I chose to raise our kids, like so many other white people, because of its diversity. Like so many white people, I knew little about Evanston's history or the Black community on whose backs we white folks celebrate that diversity. Though the signs of my childhood in South Africa aren't here, we are still significantly and unacceptably divided by race and socioeconomics in Evanston. I read Bryan Stevenson's book when I participated in Evanston Community Foundation's Leadership Evanston. It set a fire under me to get proximate, get uncomfortable, and learn a new narrative, to know the real story of Evanston, about how and why our city is so segregated. As I learned, I also met and became friends with many outstanding, resilient, talented Black residents, many of whose families have been here longer than Evanston's white residents, often because their families fled racial terror in the South. I've listened to their stories, horrific stories of exclusion and inequity, and powerful testimonies of survival against the odds. All of that is to say that though I didn't know it, I had been waiting for this museum and memorial forever. I'd also learned that there is a direct connection between Evanston and the museum that made it all the more imperative to visit. Anthony Crawford, whose story is featured there, was a great-great-grandfather of late Evanston resident and historian Doria Johnson, and Colette Allen, who is the executive director of Family Focus in Evanston. On October 21st, 1916, a white mob beat, stabbed, shot, and hanged 56-year-old Crawford in the town square of Abbeville, South Carolina, after he dared to argue with a white merchant over the price of cottonseed. Crawford had a large multi-generational family and was a successful farmer who owned 427 acres of land. Days after the lynching, Abbeville's white residents voted to expel the Crawford family and seize their property. When South Carolina's governor declared himself powerless to protect the family from violence, most of Crawford's surviving relatives fled to New York and to Illinois. Many of many Black Evanstonians trace their roots back to Abbeville and to Anthony Crawford. I knew that the only way I was willing to visit Montgomery was with my whole community, those who would appreciate the opportunity to honor their ancestors and their history, and those like me who are obligated to bear witness to our country's brutality and to our neighbors' devastating losses and the injustices they have faced for 400 years and counting. I was uncompromising about 4 things. First, participants had to come from racially and socioeconomically diverse backgrounds and be diverse in age and gender. 2, visiting the museum would have to be financially accessible to anyone who wanted to go. 3, we needed to understand clearly that we would be witnesses, supporters, and friends to our Black brothers and sisters whose history we would honor alongside them. That is, this wasn't about us, white, Latinx, and non-Black participants, other than to listen, recognize the damage done and still being done by white supremacy, and consider what each of us can do to help repair the past. 4, we had to go by bus. It would be the most economical way to travel. It would force us all to get proximate, uncomfortable, both physically and emotionally, and learn a new narrative. It would encourage us to make social, business, and activist connections across race and socioeconomics. It would be a journey rather than a trip, and it would be a symbolic hat tip to Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the courageous freedom riders of the civil rights movement. So that's a piece of my story, my dream for this journey, and how it came to be. 99 other participants have their own stories, their own reasons for signing up, their own experiences in Alabama, and their own takeaways now that we're home. I'm so glad that Kim and Darlene and Tisha and Lakeisha and Jennifer and Rena and Charlotta and Linda and Kelly are all here today, and I wish everybody was here today as well because the journey was about all of us. So on the evening of Friday, September 13th, 100 of us boarded 2 buses for a 16-hour drive each way to Montgomery to visit the Legacy Museum and Memorial and to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. We were friends and strangers, Black and white, people of color, lifelong Evanstonians, and transplants from other cities and countries. We were well off and privileged, low and fixed income. We were teachers, police officers, volunteers, doctors, activists, lawyers, students, chefs, social workers, employed, unemployed, parents, and entrepreneurs. The youngest of us was 18, the oldest 82. Sorry, Ashanti, I didn't mention your name. Even people who weren't on our buses were a vital part of our journey. Generous donors, our friends, neighbors, Facebook followers, and local businesses raised more than $12,000 to cover the $300 per person cost of the journey for the 40% of us who didn't have the funds to spare. Boxes of bagels and bags of bananas and clementines, croissants, cookies, and donuts were donated. Our commemorative t-shirts were gifted to us. We prepared carefully for our experience. Each participant was required to read 2 important books. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, by Robin DiAngelo, and of course Stevenson's Just Mercy. During 2 pre-journey gatherings, facilitators helped us to get to know each other, prepare for our experience as a diverse group, the different ways we might process the journey, and set expectations for how to respect one another's experiences. 5th-generation Evanston resident, Gilo Logan, graciously opened each gathering with a powerful and moving ceremony. Pastor Michael Neighbors, president of the NAACP and senior pastor at Second Baptist Church, blessed our journey and told us about his pilgrimage in 1992 to Gorée Island, Senegal, where captured slaves were held before crossing the ocean to America. Dino Robinson, founder of Shorefront Legacy Center, provided local Black history to contextualize our journey. As we loaded and boarded our buses in the THS parking lot, replete with a send-off by community members and leaders and a surprise police escort down Church Street and McCormick Boulevard, I breathed what felt like my first breath since our team began to plan for this moment 3 months earlier. I felt humbled and grateful and proud. Thanks to an amazing, dedicated team, Kim Holmes-Ross, Kathleen Long, Evan Finnemore, Jennifer Moran, our travel agent Felicia Brandon, and the folks who entrusted this journey to us, the dream I'd dreamed 2 years ago had materialized. Logistics-wise, it helped that Evan, Kathleen, and I were old pros at the whole bus thing, having organized 4 buses of Evanstonians to go to DC for the Women's March following Trump's inauguration. A year later, we bussed another group of Evanstonians to Springfield to protest gun violence and call for stronger gun legislation. Kim's outreach skills, enthusiasm, and connection to our community were instrumental in the outpouring of interest we received, and Jennifer's deep involvement with the Moran Center and her leadership of Leadership Evanston helped us develop important pre-journey discussions. We met, texted, talked, and emailed one another morning, noon, and night, all summer. Somehow, Felicia Brandon, a former Evanstonian living in Atlanta, kept up with our craziness and kept us on track. So here we were, 100 souls, each with our own story, settling into our seats as the sun started setting and we set our sights on the south. Each of us with our own reasons for registering for this uncomfortable journey and to grapple with what we can do together to set things right. We arrived at our hotel, crumpled, but not much worse for wear, at about 9:30 on Saturday morning. It was hot, and our hotel wasn't as ready for us as we would have liked, to say the least, but that is a whole other story. We handed out lunches, which we brought with us from Evanston, catered by Wendy and Clarence Weaver of C&W Market and Ice Cream Parlor. Some of us managed a quick shower and change of clothes, and by 12:30, our group stood in line to enter the Legacy Museum. The museum, an 11,000 square foot building, is built on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved Black people were imprisoned. It's located midway between a historic slave market and the main river dock and train station where tens of thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the height of the slave trade. By 1860, Montgomery was the capital of the domestic slave trade in Alabama, one of the 2 largest slave-owning states in America. And as an aside, it was very exciting because a week ago, today, Montgomery elected its first Black mayor. So things are moving slowly forward. The museum is powerful and packed with dramatic images and information about America's history of racial injustice and its legacy. Through art, film, sculpture, and photography, you're confronted by stark and emotional truths about the legacy of racial inequality and about the truth and reconciliation that must happen in order for us to find real solutions to contemporary problems. Soon after you enter the museum, you're greeted by a dark passageway with slave pen replicas. Here you can see, hear, and get close to what it was like to be imprisoned and awaiting sale at a nearby auction block. Holograms of enslaved women, children, and men narrate first-person accounts of the sights and sounds of the domestic slave trade. Extensive research helps you understand the racial terrorism of lynching, the humiliation of Jim Crow, and today's scourge of police brutality and mass incarceration. In one area of the museum is a stunning display of jars filled with soil collected from sites around the country where lynchings took place. And the EJI has found more than 4,000 lynchings, and there are many, many, many more. Again, Evanston's connection to the South confronted us. Everyone in our group went at their own pace to take in as much as we could of the museum's exhibits. A few participants were overwhelmed with emotion and had to step out into the daylight to breathe. We then made our own way alone, in pairs, in groups, to the memorial, a short walk or shuttle bus ride from the museum. The memorial is breathtaking. It's expansive, somber, sad, and hopeful. It's a mixture of earth and grass and flowers, poetry and prose, agonizingly beautiful sculptures, and rows of 800 steel monuments that look like rusty copper coffins. At first, you encounter these coffins at eye level, but as you walk further, they begin to rise overhead so that you feel as though you're walking beneath the thousands of victims of the noose. Each monument represents a location in the United States where a racial terror lynching took place between 1877 and 1950, and the names and dates of each lynching victim are engraved on each monument. Then there are the stories of more than 90 Black men, women, and children who were lynched, many for the smallest of transgressions. I'm not sure if you can read. But I mean, lynchings happened in front of thousands of people, crowds of people, because people were accused of theft, because people were walking behind flirted with a white woman, or complaining when a store owner refused to serve them. Finally, there's a monument park that holds rows of duplicate monuments that are waiting to be claimed, transported, and publicly installed in the counties they represent as a public recognition of the past and a step toward a hopeful future of truth, repair, and reconciliation. And just as an aside, what we'll see in years to come is who does not claim those, who does not claim those, who does not claim their past. With hope in mind, we ended our intense day of reckoning with a relaxed dinner at Martha's, a local restaurant with a delicious southern buffet. I went back several times. Mostly, I remember the banana pudding and the fellowship in the room that night. We provided some optional questions for discussion at each table. Later that evening, most older folks crashed, and younger folks and some more energetic types hit the town. On Sunday morning, we boarded our buses early and drove the 45 minutes to Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On the way, we sat silent as we listened to a recording of Martin Luther King's speech.
I'm not sure how to make this work.
Does it have a play button? Otherwise,
We have walked through desolate valleys and approached dry hills. We have walked on meandering highways.
and then we arrived at the bridge. Still named after a grand dragon of the KKK, the Edmund Pettus Bridge stands as a symbol of the momentous changes that took place in Alabama, America, and the world in 1965. Of the pain, perseverance, power, and hope of the 600 courageous marchers who tried to cross the bridge on March 7th to demand the right to vote on the day that became known as Bloody Sunday, and who successfully resumed the march 2 weeks later, this time 3,200 strong. They headed east out of Selma, across the bridge and onto Montgomery. By the time they reached the Capitol on March 25th, they were 25,000 strong. And less than 5 months later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was incredibly moving, our group together, all wearing our t-shirts, all different colors and ages, walking across that bridge with all its history of pain and perseverance, and most of all, hope. There's a Hebrew song I learned when I was a kid by Nachman of Breslov, a Hasidic Jew who lived in the 18th century. The whole world is a narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid. I sang it all the way to the other side. Exhausted but energized, we boarded our buses and headed home, passing cotton fields soaked with the sweat and agony of so many. Together, we sang Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem.
It's not.
We heard from Jay Grover and Dolores Holmes, members of the Evanston's Equity and Empowerment Committee, about the push for reparations in Evanston. We shared stories and reflections, wrote and read poetry that came to us there and then. We laughed and cried and we slept. As I sit on the bus headed back to Chicago, I begin to reflect on this incredible journey, participant Mandy Eason posted on Facebook as our buses glided home. I can't begin to put into words how powerful this trip has been. I've experienced sadness, anger, pain, empowerment, awe, disgust, heartbreak, and reverence. This trip was about so much more than absorbing facts about enslavement, mass incarceration, segregation, and Jim Crow. This was about connecting with the pain and suffering of my ancestors. This journey was everything I predicted and so much more. I hope for everyone who went that their purpose for going was fulfilled. I hope we can take all this experience and not only process it in a healthy, enlightening, and empowering way, but somehow make intentional efforts to pass that on to our children, families, friends. As we attempt to move forward in the present, we must understand, feel, and learn from the past. We arrived home at 1 a.m., and as we hugged goodbye, I knew that truths had been told, friendships forged, bridges built, and seeds sowed in many of us to get involved or more involved in working for racial and socioeconomic justice in Evanston. And we got some good coverage of the trip, which was fantastic to spread the message. And I really have to thank our partners. We have to thank our partners, the NAACP of Evanston and the North Shore, Evanston Cradle to Career, and the Evanston Community Foundation for helping to make this journey a reality. I'll end with the words that I inscribed on the wall at the memorial. For the hanged and the beaten, for the shot, drowned and burnt, for those abandoned by rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With faith, because we shall overcome. Thank you. So I'm going to turn this over to Letitia Barge and Lakeisha Barton and Kim Holmes. And maybe Kim, if you want to come up first. Or maybe all come. Oh, you might want to see you though. Oh, yeah. So why don't you all come up and then, or do you want to go one at a time?
No, I'll come up.
Okay.
While the gathering, I called your attention to the 10
Okay. No problem. Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Kimberly Holmes Ross. I actually work with Evanston Cradle to Career, so I came as one of the partners. Not sure what to expect, but Nina had a dream, and quickly I bought into the dream, into the vision. I have never worked with a group of women so passionate, so intentional, so thoughtful, as I did with this journey. Nina, Jennifer, Kathleen, Evan worked tirelessly. I was just happy to be a part of it. It was disturbingly beautiful. It broke my heart, but it gave me hope that Evanston may be on the right track to confronting and dealing with all the racial injustices in the community, at least. We can start here. So I was happy to be a part of it. We have a long way to go, but what a great start. So thank you, Nina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lakeisha Barton, and I want to share with you my experience on this journey. So I decided to go on this journey with my little sister and a group of my best friends. Most of us had recently lost our grandparents, and we had a group discussion as soon as Nina posted this on Facebook. I'm like, my whole team is going. It's important that we all go together. Why? I am African American, and I'm a born and raised Evanstonian. And I went to Martin Luther King school from kindergarten to 8th grade. So being from the community and experiencing that school at a younger age, there were some things that I did not learn. And my grandparents made it known for all of us, myself and my cousins, that we would not know much about our history and their pain and their suffering. My family is from South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, and we moved here probably about 15 years before I was even born or thought of. So when our grandparents died, so did their stories. So we decided to get shirts that you guys probably seen. Our shirts that said, time for change, creating our own her story. We wanted to change the history, and we wanted to make our own her story for myself and the group of women that went with me, so we can come back and tell our children about the experience. So what happened was, we went and I thought that this was going to be a very uncomfortable journey. What I learned was it was not as uncomfortable as I thought. What it did was it gave me opportunity to network and to build relationships with a very diverse group of people who I can now call my family. I will say that the museum, I am a community person. I work for the city of Evanston, and I work with a lot of the youth, and I deal with a lot of the gun violence that's going on within our community. So for me to go to this museum and see things that I felt were secrets and things that people were afraid to discuss with us, it was an eye-opener for me. I was the last person that I thought would have a breakdown in this museum. The minute that I saw the holographic images of two children, two little boys, I immediately broke down at the museum. I couldn't believe it. Why? I have 4 children, but I have 3 African-American sons. So I could imagine my sons being on the other side saying that they're looking for their mother. These children had no direction and they were taken from them. Half of them were renamed and they had never seen their family or their parents again. That was the first thing that I saw when I went to this museum. I thought that I was being a little funny by skipping past the first experiment on mass incarceration, and I said I would come back to it later. But going to the holographic images first, it really did something to me. I turned around and I saw people exiting, taking breathing. They were having a hard time breathing. It was a lot for them. So throughout the experience in the museum, I went and I was reading the fine print on the wall. It was really tiny. The museum is not a lot of space, and that part was probably the most uncomfortable because every time you turned around, there was someone in your face while you're trying to process all of the horrific things that you were seeing and reading. One of the most touching things that I saw was the whole wall of how they sold the slaves, what they sold them for, the things that they said about the people that they were selling, and how much they were asking for these hard-working people. It brought tears to my eyes, and I decided that I was only going to watch half of what was in the museum because it became too much for me, and that the other half I would learn from the people that I was on the bus with. So from then, as you guys seen, whenever the night fell down, those of us, we went out to kind of spend some time and debrief and talk about some of the things we learned, some of the things that I didn't get a chance to see that other people saw. So learning from others' experience is how we kind of ended the night. So I'm not going to keep this microphone too long, but I would definitely say that I think that it's important that everybody takes this trip, and I do believe that it is time for change, and I am a doer. So I believe that once we acknowledge that there was a problem, and once we acknowledge that African American people were treated very poorly, that is the only way that we will be able to get past what has happened to us and be able to move forward. So it's time for community conversations, but it's time for doing things and getting things done. So let's not just have conversations and talk about our past. Let's create memories and change the future. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Letitia Barge. That's my married name. I was born Letitia Parks Payne at 1826 Brown Avenue 70 years ago in a house because African Americans could not go to the then established hospitals in Evanston. I had a dream the first of this year. My sons knew, oh, Ma, you're going to have a 70th birthday. What do you want? I said, I want to go to Alabama and I want to find out who I am. I have 3 different birth certificates, 3 different legal names, 2 different fathers, and 2 different spellings of my mother's name. Nina started me on a journey by reading. I had read a lot of books, but then I joined Dear Evanston, where I had to really confront that post-traumatic slave syndrome, and it's real. It's real. Stress is real. If post-traumatic stress is real, so is post-traumatic stress, a slave syndrome. My journey started the day that we left for Montgomery. I sent in my ancestry DNA. Since then, I went to Montgomery and I found my 2 great-grandfathers that I never had a grandfather because they were outspoken as I am. It's in the DNA. And they were lynched. When you see those columns, do not assume that there is one name on that column. there were 20, 30, 40 names on each one of those columns. The sad part were the unknowns, taken from their homes. What started my family on their journey was when Anthony Crawford was lynched on October 22nd, 1916. My grandfather joined the draft, went into the military to get out of Abbeville, South Carolina. It started the great Negro exodus out of the South to the North. And what a lot of people are missing is that Anthony Crawford was born in 1865, born a free man. But because he was a free man and the richest man in Abbeville, there was a lot of resentment. He wasn't a sharecropper. He was a landowner. And one day, having a quibble, an argument with a white man over the price of his cotton, he got too uppity. So 200 mad, raging to 400 crazed white people took him, abused him, lynched him, shot him over 200 times, drug him through the black section of Abbeville, South Carolina. Talk about domestic terrorism. That's domestic terrorism. And that was to let everybody know this is what's going to happen to you when you get too uppity and you think you're equal and you think you're a citizen of the United States and you are a person of color. I am 70 years old. I was born into Jim Crow right in this town. In 1954, I was part of the experiment at Dewey School, my alma mater, where they took African-American children and they tested us. And they took the gifted ones. I didn't know I was gifted. They took us, a psychologist from Northwestern tested us. And in 1954, we were mainstream at Dewey School. Nina always tells me, oh, I love your Jewishness. And I answered her back, well, the last time I checked, the Jesus I serve is Jewish, and I came up in a Jewish environment. My father was a minister. He taught me what a rabbi was. So we went between the church and the temple. And I emulated what was fed into me, but he also taught me who I was. On this journey, I sent my pie chart off to Ancestry.com the day we left. I got the information back. And it was reading this horrific story. I want you to, all these expensive phones you have, just Google it. The lynching of Anthony Crawford. Educate yourselves, know the truth. I hope that they said, you know what, I never thought I'd live to see a black man in the White House, but I lived to see that, so anything is possible. There is a book by Mr. Coates. It says we had 8 great years. He's not talking about Barack Obama. He's talking about Reconstruction, because during Reconstruction, the African Americans were so successful that they became a financial threat to the very economic system of this country. And it was determined then, do not educate them. If you could read, you could put it in your head. If you could write, you could make out a pass and go get the freedom. And they didn't teach us how to swim. You know why? Because then I would have been capable of jumping off the ship, swimming the Alabama River to freedom. So if you could read, write, and swim, you were a threat. And a lot of those things still exist subliminally through our children. All we have ever asked is access, equal opportunity, liberty and justice for all, that all get liberty and justice. I thank God this is my sister. We went away, came back. This is my tribe. My tribe is now made up of all nations. And as I came into the building this morning, I have to say this. I lived through the polio epidemic right here. I lived through the tuberculosis epidemic right here. I lived through influenza killing people right here in Evanston. When I came up and I saw the statue with the children, thank God for vaccinations. Because at 18 months, I went into a sanitarium with tuberculosis. I have friends that are crippled today now because of polio. I had friends that were died of measles and mumps. Please, people, we prayed at one time for vaccinations, for a cure, and if not for a cure, so that thousands and tens of thousands of people would not die. Now, every person that is here this morning, I'm asking you to do something for Grandma Barge. You don't have to show up for all the meetings, but become a card-carrying member of the NAACP. If you put your money where your mouth is, I am so tired of rhetoric. How many in this room is over 70? Then you were born in Jim Crow. Don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Make that a stepping stone. But all this, please, become a member of the NAACP. Support us. Put your money where your mouth is. I thank God for the Rotary Club. It's been here all of my life. I thank God for, I sat down here at this clock where it says Togo. I just got my pie chart back. Togo is one of my tribes. God is good. Thank you, Nina. I found myself. I found my great-grandfathers. I found my relatives who just disappeared into the dark of night, and you made it possible.
And everybody involved. We present a book to the Evanston Public Library in thanks to our speakers, and there is a nameplate inside. So this says it is presented in honor of Nina Cavan, October 15th, 2019. And you gave us the language for this when you talked about disappearing, because the book is called Friends Disappear, The Battle for Racial Equality in Evanston by Mary Barr. So we're going to pass this along tonight. And if I could have everybody involved up here, we would like to get a picture of you before.
Wait, can we have our travel mates come too?
Yeah. Everybody that went to Montgomery,
Absolutely.
come on.
Absolutely.
Come on. This is my tribe.
Okay. You're looking the wrong way. Okay, we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you.